Hey everybody, welcome. As everyone trickles in here, I think we're just going to wait a minute or two to get started, but really excited to have everyone here today. I'm Laura, I'm going to be your host, so welcome. Well, I'm going to get started. So today is Talk B for Magnify, and this is our second round of talks at the conference. And today the talks are really about looking at our everyday. My name's Laura Holleran, and my pronouns are she and her, and I'm going to be your host today. So I'm a white woman with brown hair up in a ponytail, really bright pink shirt on today, with a whiteboard behind me. And I'd like to start now with just giving an acknowledgement. And I'm currently in Mi'kma'ki, which is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And this territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which Mi'kmaq and Maliseet peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1725. So the treaties did not deal with the surrendering of land and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. So today we're going to be going through 4 different talks today from our speakers who are all here to take it all in together and answer any of your questions as they come in. And you can answer questions and post questions in 2 different ways. So there's a Q&A tab in Zoom where you can write and type questions. And then the speakers are going to choose a couple that they'd like to answer after everyone's talks, and they'll do that live. But it can also type responses as you use them. So the talks are pre-recorded, and we've used videos to do that, and they're captioned by real people to really help make them as precise as possible. But for the Q&A portion, we are going to be using automatic captioning. And to do and use that, there should be a menu option in your Zoom with 3 little dots, and that you can access the captions or transcripts through there. We're also going to be sharing a link to the playlist of the pre-recorded chat in the Zoom chat. And so anybody that wants to play with the settings and set up what makes sense for them can do so. And Claudia is going to send that to everyone right now. And before we get into the great talks we have today, I just want to remind everyone about our code of conduct. So whenever you're asking questions or chatting to people in our Slack group, we really want to remind everyone that we are really dedicated to ensuring that our online space is harassment-free for everybody, regardless of gender, age, sexual orientation, disability, physical appearance, body size, race, or religion, or lack thereof. We're really not tolerating any kind of harassment in any kind of form. And anybody kind of violating those rules are going to be removed from the conference without a refund. And Claudia is going to share that if you just want to read through it in the chat as well. Okay, so enough from me. We can get started. So today we're looking at our everyday, and it's a group of talks that are just really looking at daily user research and the design processes that we're going through. Each speaker really references different components of the journey, from things like recruitment emails you send to the tests that we're running and the font you're using. And along each step, a speaker is going to highlight how we can make these processes a bit more inclusive and accessible. So we're going to get into the first talk, which is 11 minutes, and it is titled Make Privacy and Consent Forms Easier to Understand. And our speakers for that today are Adrienne and Yadida. So Adrienne is an East Asian woman in her late 20s. She's got black hair tied in a bun in her talk, in her video. She's going to be wearing headphones and a purple linen shirt with some embroidery. She's sitting in a room with a plant, a piano, some art, and some string lights behind her. And then Yadida is a white woman with gray hair and glasses. She's wearing headphones and a denim shirt. She's sitting in a blue upholstered chair, and there's a large, colorful painting behind her. So Adrienne actually can't be live with us today. So when you are asking questions related to this talk, we're going to send them along to her, but Yadida is going to be here to answer anything live for us. Okay, and hope you enjoy the talk.
Hello, my name is Adrienne. I'm a design researcher.
And I'm Yadida. I'm a content designer.
We work at the Canadian Digital Service, where we work in multidisciplinary teams. We're going to talk to you today about how we collaborated on the privacy and consent forms for research activities to increase the diversity of participants. So this is a brief representation of the steps a research participant might go through to participate in research. So from awareness of the research activity to interest and participation, the sign-up process, receiving the invite, deciding to participate, participating in the research activity itself, the debrief, and the receiving compensation. So what we're looking for throughout this whole process is for a large diversity of people to go through these steps and to have a good experience. Barriers to entry can be present at any of these steps. This reduces how many people participate in a research activity and the diversity of people. If we don't have participation from a diverse group of people, we're limited in our ability to build an inclusive product. Now, we won't be talking about every barrier today. We'll be focusing on the decide to participate step. So in order to decide to participate in most research activities, participants need to give informed consent. And this is a typical privacy and consent form we would use. And like other typical legal documents, it uses a lot of jargon and difficult sentence structures. And I know it's difficult to see on the screen here for the text, but how would you feel looking at this? You may feel intimidated or uncomfortable about participating. You might not participate at all if you feel like you don't know what you're getting yourself into. It may reduce participation, especially from people who speak English as a second language and people who have literacy challenges. So though not often intended by the researcher, participants can feel uncomfortable at any point in the research process due to physical, social, and economic power imbalances. Conducting research in government, there's an added imbalance due to perceived and real power that government employees have over people's lives. Many government employees make decisions about whether someone can be accepted into a social program, have filed their taxes correctly, and whether you can become a citizen. Even though Yedida and I don't hold such roles in government, many people perceive the government as one big monolith. So the privacy and consent form is a really critical piece to making a participant feel comfortable in participating in research, and it's an attempt from us to cede some power. And as a government team, there are specific information a privacy and consent form must include, but the generalizable list of information for teams outside of government might look like this. So you need to outline the consequences of participation, identify the types of data that you'll be collecting, how participants can access or retrack the data that you've collected about them, who you'll share the data with, and where participants can go if they have a complaint. So Yedida will walk us through some content design best practices that we use to improve the privacy and consent form. And not every team has access to a content designer, but we're hoping that these are still helpful.
So we try to use the active voice, and that's because it's more difficult to understand sentences when the verbs are in the passive tense. And let's look at an example so that I can give you a better explanation of this. So in the original privacy and consent form, we said Qualtrics is being used on behalf of the government of Canada. The new version says we use a company called Qualtrics to collect and store data. So earlier in the document, we had explained that we would refer to the government of Canada. So we were able to replace government of Canada with we. And then if you change the sentence to the active voice, it becomes we use Qualtrics. And so you'll see that when you do that, there's some ambiguity, and we see that there's questions that people might have. What is Qualtrics? What is Qualtrics being used for? So that helps us then to realize that ambiguity and to answer those questions with some more detail. We use a company called Qualtrics to collect and store data. Another thing we do in content design is avoid technical words and avoid clumping nouns together in what we call noun strings. And again, an example will help me to explain that. So the original said, please read their data security protection statement for more details. So you've got a noun string with data security protection statement. Those 4 words are nouns and they're all technical words. So that becomes hard for people to unpack. So that's why we explain, we unpack it for them and we say, you can read how Qualtrics protects data and privacy. The reason part of this sentence is underlined is that in the document, we hyperlink that part of the sentence to parts of the Qualtrics screen that give more detail about this, because we want to acknowledge that there are some people who will want more information about this and make it easy for them to get that information. Headings are a really important part of content design. We know that many people will just scan or skim the page to find the information that we're looking for. So we work with them on that. We give them headings so they can do that more efficiently. And headings also allow us to organize and give hierarchy to our document and to decide what's the most important parts. We don't have time today to discuss how we made decisions in this document about what to put first, but I just want to flag that it was and is part of the process of coming up with headings, and it's also one of the benefits of using headings. So in the example, the stars show you the headings, and you can see that just by looking at those, you get some key information. The information is that you have a choice, that if you agree to this, that if you make that choice to participate, that you're agreeing to certain things, and you can see exactly where in the document you can agree you can read about what you're agreeing to, and you can also easily find the section on privacy. Headings have another function as well. We can use them to guide the participant through what they need to do and the order of steps that they need to follow. Again, an example will help me to show this. So most of our headings indicate the step that the reader needs to take, and this includes the most important heading on the page, the title. So in the original, we had welcome, but in our new version, it becomes decide if you'll participate in this survey. So immediately people know what they need to do, and for some people, they know right from that that they are not interested in reading further, that they don't want to participate. And so they don't have to spend the time reading further. On one side here, you have our original privacy and consent form, and then you'll see the new version on the other side. Another change in our version is that there are less words. The original had 380, our version has 235. Now, I want to stress that reducing the number of words is not the goal of content design. Sometimes you may need to increase the number of words to make things clear and explain what people need to know. But one thing that you always do with content design is remove words that are not necessary or do not serve a purpose, so that the reader does not have to spend time on them, so that the document is easier to read and more accessible. And in doing that, in this case, we came up with a shorter document and a document that we hope is easier to read. We like to think of content design as equity seeking work, because by making our content easier for everyone to understand, we're hoping that we've leveled the playing field between the people with power over the content and the people who need to understand the content.
So in terms of next steps, we talked about how we use some best practices to improve the form, but we'll be looking to see how inclusive the form is in real life. And we'll also be considering what other barriers might exist in the research participation experience that I've outlined earlier, such as the tools we use and other processes that we might use. So thank you very much for your attention, and extra thanks to our colleagues who helped out with this presentation. And a few links are posted here for more information on this topic.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Adrienne and Yadina, for your talk. That's great. First one done. So we're going to go into our second talk now. I'm just going to highlight a couple things. So the next talk's a bit longer. It's 54 minutes in length. After that, we have a 10-minute break scheduled. Then we'll have our 2 following talks in that half-hour span, and that's going to be followed by another break for 15 minutes, and then we'll do a Q&A. And remember, for the questions, you can post those in the chat, and the speakers will get to it at that Q&A point. All right. So our next talk is titled Accessibility Research and Testing with People with Disabilities, Why It Matters and Why Current Practices Need to Change by Samuel. So Sam is a white man in his 30s. He has short dark hair and a beard and is wearing headphones. He's also wearing a white checkered button shirt, and there's a poster of the Beatles behind him. So I'll pass it off to Sam. Sam's video too. Sorry, I didn't mean to make you panic there, Sam. Think that you had to give a speech there. Sorry. All right, Claudia, go ahead and turn on that video.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're all enjoying the Magnify conference as it goes on. There's a lot of great talks and programming that have been taking place and will continue to take place. But today I'm here to talk to you about accessibility testing and accessibility research, and why these things matter, and why the current practices need to change. Because as we all know, websites remain inaccessible and are not becoming accessible as quickly as we would like. And when they do become accessible, sometimes they are not accessible to everyone. That said, let me start by talking a little bit about myself. I'm the accessibility evangelist here at Fable. So I spend a lot of time talking to companies and conferences and designers about why accessibility matters, about why it's so important to make sure that the websites that you're building are fully accessible, and how come it's so critical to involve the voices of actual users in the accessibility testing process. Because, as the saying goes, nothing about us without us. In my personal life, I moderate a lot of Reddit subreddits, including R Blind, the official subreddit for blind folks. I have been a blind screen reader user for my entire life. I certainly count myself as an expert screen reader user. And I'm a reader. I read tons and tons of science fiction, especially in ebook format, and play a lot of games. The game I've been really playing a lot of right now is the collectible card and deck building game Hearthstone. But that aside, let's move on to the actual talk that we'll be going over today. So today we're going to cover, things that you should be considering before beginning your accessibility research, because it's so important. We all know, I think, that people with disabilities are included in research, but there's a lot of things that we need to go over to make sure that the inclusion actually happens, to make sure that the inclusion happens in a way that is equal and accessible and that works both for the researcher and the participant. And so then that also goes into recruiting. It's not enough just to say, oh, well, we need to recruit people with disabilities to be involved in our testing, in our research, et cetera. Who should we be recruiting? When should we be starting the recruiting process? And how should we be doing that recruiting process? And then once we've got everyone recruited, we need to actually do that research, and we need to get those high quality results that we're looking for. We want to get that actionable feedback, and we want to get our research questions really answered. And there are some methodologies and some things that we do in research that work very well, and there are some things that don't work so well. And so we'll be covering a few of those. And then we'll be talking about follow-up. Because too often when the research is done and the data has been collected, we tend to think our job's done. That's all, we're done. We don't have to do anything else. But when it comes to establishing a research process, and when it comes to getting in a cycle of performing regular research, that follow-up is important if we want to be able to recruit new participants, and if we want the existing participants to feel like participating in our research was worthwhile, is something they would like to do again, or perhaps is something that they might like to recommend to their friends, helping us recruit more participants to participate in this research. So that said, let's get started. Let's get started with the things that you need to be thinking about before you start doing the research, before you even start doing the actual research, collecting the actual data. And the first thing to think about is online research versus in-person research. Now, of course, with the pandemic and what has happened over the recent year, we've been doing a lot of online research. The problem is the online research that we've been conducting hasn't really been by choice. We've been doing online research because we have to do it. And before COVID began, there was a real preference, especially when doing research with people with disabilities, to bring people in, to conduct research offline, right? We wanted to build those assistive labs. We wanted to bring people into our offices. We wanted to sort of fully record them. We wanted to get them using our equipment. And I think that COVID has shown a lot of people something that we at Fable have believed for a long time. That's not always the best way to conduct research. And, you know, there are a few reasons for that. When you're performing research online, you get to include a much wider variety of participants. There are, of course, some participants with disabilities who, you know, may be low vision or maybe deaf or may have some challenge that doesn't really affect their ability to travel. And for those folks, it's easy to get their voices heard, you know, even if the research is offline. But if you have challenges that require you to book specialized travel in advance, if you are a user of a wheelchair, if you are completely blind and rely on accessible busing and accessible transit options that either don't exist in some places or are not easy to access or are not great, that can limit your ability to participate in in-person research. Whereas when you participate in online research, every voice can be heard, no matter if the person's disability affects their ability to travel or not. They get to participate in your research on an equal footing with everyone else. And a second big advantage to doing your research online is that it allows you to collect real world results. Every piece of assistive technology and assistive device is highly customized to its users. Before coming to Fable, I myself, as a university student and freelancer, have participated in many research opportunities as a blind person, wanting to help people out, wanting to make their products more accessible. And I can't count the number of times I've gone into an assistive lab and I've sat down in front of the computer that they want me to use, and you've got all prepared for me to do this research, and I'm saying, I can't, this screen reader hasn't been configured properly. I can't use it like this. This isn't working. As you probably aren't expert screen reader users, you probably haven't tested to make sure that the technology is working, you know, not only the way I expect it to, but just working properly on that computer. Whereas when I'm using my own computer, I get to have the voice that I'm familiar with, running at the speed that I'm familiar with, in the configurations that I've set up and customized on a computer that I know works not only the way I want it to, but just works correctly. And that's not just for screen reader users. If you are, for example, a voice control user, you have probably spent months or even years or even a decade at this point training your dictation software and your voice control software to best understand your voice, training it to understand the words that you use for certain things, giving it custom command words and shortcuts. And if you come into a lab and you're now trying to participate in this research, none of those things are going to be available to you. And so the experience that you have is going to be a negative one, not necessarily because you you know, are having a struggle with the actual website or application, but just because nothing works the way you want it to. So again, another huge advantage to online research. And you know, a lot of the custom equipment that folks have, they can't travel with it. It's set up in a home. It's set up in a particular environment that works well for them. Of course, when you're online, another great advantage is that with screen sharing software, with meeting software, with video software, the webcam's already there. The screen is already being shared. If in the case of a screen reader, the system audio can be shared. And so it becomes very easy to record and document not just the participant and the participant's face and what they're doing, but also what the computer's doing, what they're seeing, what they're hearing, the interaction that they're having, in a way that when you're doing in-person research can be a little bit harder. Of course, offline research, bringing people into an assistive lab, bringing people into your office, it's a lot easier for the researcher, right? There's less setting up of online software. There's maybe a little bit less fiddling with technology. Maybe it's a little bit more comfortable for you. They're using the provided equipment. So, you've been able to do some setup in advance, which again makes things easier for you, the researcher. But unfortunately, when we put the convenience of the researcher above the convenience of the participant, especially in the field of working with people with disabilities, what we find is that the results are not the high quality results that we would hope, and that the results are very negatively impacted. Now, of course, I don't want to discount, there is one particular type of research where it is often better to conduct in-person research, and that's when you're dealing with hardware. If you're researching the accessibility of a pin pad or a new bank machine or a new piece of hardware, you don't necessarily want to, mail it off or ship it off to the participant's home and let them figure out how to set it up. When you're dealing with a hardware product, that offline research, that bringing them in, can be better. But in my mind, I think that's one of the few exceptions that we find, and that in most cases, for the convenience of the participant, in order to collect those high quality results, it's so much better if you can do the research online. Now, we've spent a bunch of time on that because it's important. But another thing that is important is, before you even start the research, making sure that the tools and that the processes are going to be accessible. Again, it's happened to me a lot where I've been asked to come into an offline research space and realize that there is no accessible travel option to get there. But it can happen with online research as well. There can be contracts that need to be signed. There can be NDAs that need to be signed. And too often, when I was a participant, and I've seen other companies have this flaw as well, the participant comes in the day of, and suddenly they realize, oh, before we can start the research, we need you to sign this contract, but it's not available in any kind of accessible format. There's no accessible way for you to sign it. We better scramble and figure something out. I guess we're going to have to sit here and read you the whole contract. And it's not a great experience for the participant, and it's not a great experience for the researcher, because that time that you could have otherwise been using to do research is now taken up trying to figure out how to get a contract that is accessible, how to get a contract that is signed, how to get everything past the lawyers. It's far better to think about that in advance, so that you can send the participant, hey, here's the contract, it's fully accessible, here's the accessible signing method, you can do this before we start the research, and make sure that's a smooth process. There's a bunch of other pre-research tasks that need to happen when research is being conducted, whether it's filling out screening questionnaires, whether it's screening interviews, whether it's filling out biographical information, or sometimes it's downloading and installing a meeting tool and connecting to the VPN. Again, it's really critical to make sure that all of this stuff is accessible before you start the research, because you don't want to find yourself in a position where you've recruited a participant and they're happy to be involved, and suddenly they've hit 4 accessibility barriers before the research has even begun. It's not a smooth process. It's not a great process. It's going to impact the results that you get. And it may even result in participants just dropping out, saying, hey, listen, this isn't worth my time. All of this stuff is just not worth it to me. So once you've done those things, once you've made sure that the tools and that the pre-research processes and that all of these environments and things are accessible, once you've decided where the research is going to take place, whether it's going to be online research, whether it's going to be offline research, the next thing to think about is who the participants are, where they're going to come from, how you're going to recruit them. So let's dive into that a little bit. First of all, let's talk about who we're recruiting. There is often a thought in the research community that assistive technology research is in a way kind of similar to ethnographic research or similar to market research. And in a very critical way, it isn't. The demographics of a participant do not matter to the extent that the disability related characteristics of the participant matter. Because what you're trying to determine is the experience accessible? Is it usable? And is it a great experience with assistive technology? And so it's not important that you get someone who's between the ages of 20 and 30, someone who's between the ages of 30 and 40, and someone who's between the ages of 40 and 50, and that you get 3 single parents and 2 people who own minivans. What's important is that you make sure you're covering the widest possible variety of assistive technologies. If you're on a desktop platform, it does you no good if the only participants that you've tested with are using Macs, because there's probably going to be some accessibility error that Mac is able to compensate for and that won't affect those participants that may be a total blocker on Windows. And it could be, vice versa. It could happen the other way around as well. So you want to make sure that you're testing with a wide variety of assistive technologies across a wide variety of platforms, wherever your app or product is going to be available. And you want to make sure that you're covering different assistive technology on each platform. If you really want a truly accessible product, you need to be testing with more than just screen reader users. You need to be testing with screen magnification users. You need to be testing with users of voice control software. You want to be testing with users of head tracking. You want to be testing with switch systems. So you aren't going to be able to test with every single assistive technology on the planet, because that's a big ask. But what's important is that in your recruiting plan, you get as wide a variety of software, of platform, of assistive tech types that you possibly can. And it's more important that you're testing different assistive technologies than it is that you're testing different browsers. It's more important that you're testing users with different challenges and different needs than it is that you're covering every possible age group. But too often we tend to think of assistive technology research and of research involving people with disabilities as just another form of market research. And so we make sure that we cover all of the ages and genders, but we didn't really think about it, and we've only been testing with users of JAWS, and that's it. We haven't tested with anything else, even any other screen readers, never mind other users of other assistive technology. So it's critical to focus on who you're going to recruit and figure out, make sure you can get that variety, because accessibility is about so much more than screen readers, as I've covered. Screen readers are a great place to start, but they are not a great place to stop. And sometimes you may find that it is better not to start with screen readers. You may want to, for example, if you are doing prototype reviews that you have already built in a system like Figma, you may want to start with screen magnification users, because they will be able to access that prototype and they will be able to give you feedback on that prototype in a way that a screen reader user may not. And so, everyone thinks in accessibility, oh, we'll start with screen reader users and expand out. But depending on what you're doing, that might not be the best approach. It may be better to start with screen magnification or with voice dictation and expand out. If you're working with video materials, you may want to start with captions and then expand out. So, it's just too often accessibility gets centered around screen readers. Screen readers are where it begins, screen readers are where it ends. And it's important for us as researchers, as designers, as accessibility advocates to push back against that. Another thing to be thinking about is skill level. Now, there are some kind of pitfalls that people fall into. There is an idea that, oh, we should be testing all of our websites with beginner assistive technology users. Our ideal participant is someone who is a very beginner computer user, has no technical knowledge, has just sat down in front of a screen reader, or has just, isn't an expert with their assistive technology. The problem with that is that you need participants who are skilled enough to understand what the expected behavior of a website or app is, and to understand how your website or app or the thing that you're researching is deviating from that expectation. They also need to be able to understand if the problems that they're having or the bad experience that they're having is because of a problem with their assistive technology. Perhaps it's not working correctly at the moment. Technical gremlins happen to everyone at all times. Perhaps it is a function of the assistive technology that exists, but they themselves don't know how to use it, and they could just look it up in the manual. Or perhaps it really is a serious accessibility flaw with your website. And if you start with really novice beginner assistive technology users, they're not going to be able to tell you those things. And the results and the suggestions that they give could actually be things that will make the experience for intermediate users, for expert users, for users who are just 6 months in and are not even beginners anymore, more difficult. They could be recommending changes that make things too verbose, or changes that wouldn't be helpful if they only knew, oh, the assistive technology can do this for you, and just make that a lot easier. So you don't want to be recruiting WCAG certified experts, but you also don't want to be recruiting complete beginners who have never had any training on how to use their assistive technology. That said, logistics. That's another thing that is really important to think about when recruiting. And so the first thing is when. If you are recruiting for in-person testing, I had talked in the past about those troubles with travel. Some paratransit organizations can require up to 2 weeks notice in order to book a trip. And so in order to recruit participants for offline, you really need to be thinking a month out. You need to be telling them, hey, this is going to happen in a month. You've been accepted into the study. Now it's time for us to work together to plan how you're going to get here at the time we need you to be here. Because if you don't give that time, they're not going to be able to book the paratransit. They're not going to be able to figure out the travel. They're not going to have the time to get in. And so because of that, a lot of them aren't even going to bother to answer, oh, there's an in-person study taking place in 4 days. I'm not even going to bother. It's way too quick. For online testing, 2 weeks out is generally enough. Of course, if you put things too far out, people forget, people have other commitments, people have things that come up. But 2 weeks out allows the participant enough time to figure out whether they're available, and enough time for you and the participant to work together to figure out what are those pre-research steps. Where's that accessible contract that we need you to sign? Where's that meeting software that we need you to install and get familiar with so you can participate? All of that good stuff. And then of course there's where do you recruit? Community partners are a really great place and a really great relationship for you to develop, because too often, unfortunately, we all know that the internet is not always a great place. And there are people who want to take advantage. There are scams. There are things that are too good to be true. And unfortunately, people with disabilities are all too often especially targeted by these folks. And so if you're just randomly posting on Facebook groups, hey, I'm so-and-so you've never heard of from this company that you've never heard of, and we'd like you to participate in research with us and sign these contracts, there's no trust there. Nobody's going to respond because, like, is this a scam? Is this just another one of these things? Is this taking advantage of me? Whereas if you work with a community partner, and you can gain the trust of that partner, whether it's an organization that's devoted to blind folks, or a disability organization in the area of helping folks who have physical challenges. When you work with that organization and say, hey, we are conducting research in partnership with organization that you know and trust, the response rate goes way up, because people know, hey, if this company does something bad to me, I can talk to the organization. There's somewhere I can go, and also the organization has probably vetted this company. I mean, if you're a Microsoft, maybe you don't need to do that. But then on the other hand, if you're just posting randomly on Facebook, how do they know you're really the organization that you say you are? Whereas if you're coming through a community partner, you've got that trust built in. And the community partner will probably know who's best for you to approach. They probably have lists of participants. They probably have lists of people who are interested in different things, people who are willing to participate in different things. And so they might be able to help you target your recruiting a little bit better as well. That said, social media can be useful and it can be used. Reddit is a big one. Facebook is a big one. And the thing about these social media groups is that they are moderated. And so a good technique, if you are using social media, is to contact the moderators of a particular group and say, hey, we are recruiting for this particular research. We'd like to recruit these particular people. Is it okay for us to post? And when you do that, you get the moderators of the group on board. They're not just seeing it as another piece of spam. But again, it's that ability for you to say, hey, we've been vetted by somebody. We're not just sort of randomly coming here and spamming. And you've gained the trust of the moderators who have let you post to that particular social media group. And again, that brings the rates way up. And the last thing that's important to do when you're recruiting is to mention compensation. Because too often we have folks who say, hey, will you participate in our research? It's kind of voluntary, but for 6 hours of work as an honorarium, we'll give you a $15 Amazon gift card. And the use of assistive technology is a skill. It's a skill that has to be learned, and it's a skill that you don't just know as soon as you have a disability. And just like any other skilled participant, people with disabilities should be fairly compensated for the work that they're doing. And lastly, a lot of researchers underestimate the effort. If you are doing in-person research, by the time somebody books their travel, figures all that stuff out, something that's an hour engagement for you has taken their entire day. Similarly, if it's online and the meeting software needs to be figured out and the pre-setup needs to be done and the contract needs to be signed, all of that stuff is taking up a participant's time. So it's important to make sure that you are compensating participants with real actual money and that you are compensating them fairly for the real actual amount of time that is involved. Because there are a lot of companies who are recruiting, and people only have so much time to devote to being participants, to devote to testing, to devote to studies. And so if you are not compensating folks, all of the skilled users, all of the people that you most want to talk to are the people who are not going to respond. And so it's critical, not only for fairness and because it's the moral thing to do and it's the right thing to do, but because it's the thing to do that will get you the results that you need. And so a few other things when we're talking about recruiting and we're talking about the how. It's really important to be open about expectations. Things shouldn't be changing at the last minute. You say, oh, well, this is going to be, a 45-minute engagement, and suddenly you've gone on and it's 3 hours later. It's really important to be open about what you're looking for. Hey, we're really looking for feedback about this, or we're really looking for someone who's familiar with this particular application or software, or who has these particular skills. Because the more open you are about what you're looking for, about the kind of feedback you want, the more comfortable participants will be and the more responses that you're likely to get. One thing that you'd think would be super obvious and that you'd think I shouldn't even have to say, but I do have to say it. Make sure the contact methods are accessible and easy. Too often people recruit for people with disabilities and the screener form that they have to fill out is not accessible. The controls and buttons aren't labeled. There's a CAPTCHA. There's some other hoop to jump through that is inaccessible. And then the company is left wondering, hey, why didn't anyone with a disability respond to our thing? Why does nobody want to take part in our research? And it's because you haven't thought about that portion of things. And that's another thing that's part of the research. And it's not something, that we should have to say, but it is something that we have to say. Make sure that signing up to participate is easy, is accessible, doesn't involve hoops. And the last important thing to do is when you're recruiting folks, follow up. Even if they're not a good match for you, maybe they're from a country where you can't accept participants. Maybe they don't quite have the skill you're looking for. Maybe you've hit your quota for screen magnification users. If you follow up, people are not left like they're just, screaming into a void and like they fill out this application and they never get heard from and nothing ever happens. Because the problem is you are, in all likelihood, if you are making accessibility research and testing part of a regular process at your company, as you should be, and as I'm sure a lot of you at this conference want to be doing, you are going to want to recruit more participants down the line. And if somebody's filled out a form for you and heard nothing, when you come around again, they're not going to bother the second time, because why would they? They never heard back from the first one. And so if you follow up, it means that you can build that pool of participants. Maybe you even follow up and you say, hey, you're not a good fit for this right now, but we'll keep you on our mailing list so that when the next opportunity comes around, you'll be the first to know. And that lets you build the participant community and the participant pool from research engagement to research engagement over the years. And when you're working with people with disabilities who can already be a little bit more difficult to recruit, a little bit harder to find, a little bit harder to target, building and maintaining and caring for that participant pool can be the difference between failure and success of your third and fourth research engagement. So now you've got all of your pre-setup done. Everything's accessible, hopefully. Everything's a great experience. Everything's a smooth experience. You've been able to recruit all of the participants that you want. You've got that great distribution of folks across multiple platforms and assistive technologies. And now it's time to get down to actually performing the research. And there's some tips and some tricks and some things to think about here as well. First of all, prototype reviews. A lot of research is done in the early stages with prototype reviews. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but prototype reviews work very well for screen magnification users, for voice control, eye tracking, head mouse, switch systems, but they don't work that well for screen reader users, because in the case of most design systems, all a prototype is really is an image. There's no code behind it. And what screen reader users care about is they care about the information architecture. They care about the heading structure. They care about how the images have been described. They care about how the buttons have been labeled. And so it is more than possible to do prototype reviews with screen reader users. And we at Fable have done so with great success, and we've worked with other companies who have done so very successfully. But the trick is to move away from thinking about a visual prototype and to move towards thinking about a prototype that actually represents the information architecture that you're going to have. One really great way to do that is with a Word document. It won't look at all visually similar to what your website's going to be, but for a screen reader user, you could very easily use something like Microsoft Word or Google Docs to lay out the heading structure, to mark up the lists, to write down, how you're going to describe your images, how the buttons will be labeled, what the links will be, what will happen when a certain button is clicked. All of that kinds of stuff could easily be written out in Google Docs, Microsoft Word, Excel, Google Sheets. Anything that will let you present structure to a screen reader can be used for a prototype review. You could also describe an interaction. And describe sort of, okay, you're on this page, and what would you do first? What would you expect to find? What hotkeys would you expect to use? But the critical thing is that screen reader users, in order to participate in a prototype review, need more than an image. But that absolutely doesn't mean that they can't or shouldn't participate in a prototype review. It just means that you've got to think about that before you start bringing folks in. Now, another popular research method is what researchers often call the think aloud method. And so that's where you are asking someone to perform a task, and you're asking participants, as you work, tell me what you're thinking, tell me what's going through your mind, tell me what you're doing, and tell me why you're doing it. Now, for some folks, that can work all right. If you're a screen magnification user, that's probably fine. But if you're a screen reader user, your screen reader is going to be talking constantly. So you can be under a lot of cognitive load if you're trying to listen to your screen reader and you're trying to talk at the same time. And as we know, the more kind of research-related cognitive load that we place someone under, the poorer our results will be, because we're not really replicating those real-world conditions. But another thing is that it puts a lot of cognitive load on the researcher as well, because you're trying to take notes and you're hearing two voices talking at the same time constantly. And it can be really distracting, and it can be really difficult for you. And of course, voice control users, they talk to their computers. They are using their voice to give the computer commands, to dictate, to tell it where to click. And so for them, think aloud can be really confusing, because okay, I have to talk to the computer and I have to talk to the researcher at the same time. And sometimes the computer will end up listening to something intended for the researcher. And sometimes the computer won't be listening because, they were talking to the researcher and now they're trying to talk to the computer. And it can just be a really big and confusing thing. And so one good way to do that, and to think about how to better allow participants to conduct the research task while not increasing that cognitive load and not increasing cognitive load and confusion on you, the researcher, is to think about dividing things up into microtasks. So don't give them the entire task to do all at once. Okay, I want you to find 3 products. I want you to add them to the shopping cart, and then I want you to go here and I want you to sort by price. Consider breaking it up into microtasks. Ask them to find the product first. Once they've done it, say, okay, what were you thinking while you did that? Why did you do? What did you do? Why did you do it? Once they've described that process to you, then say, okay, now add it to the cart, and just break it up into microtasks like that, so that there's a very clear transition between the participant is performing the task, then the participant is telling you about the 30-second thing they just did while it's fresh in their mind, but they're not trying to do those two things at once. And we find just that little modification to the think aloud method is really great for improving the results that you get, improving the understanding that you have, lessening the cognitive load on both of you. It can also allow you to help guide a participant when they go astray, and to help you understand exactly what's going wrong. If the one microtask is add to cart and that particular button is inaccessible or won't work, having things broken up into microtasks like that makes it much easier for you as the researcher to document what's happened, and for you as the researcher to understand where exactly things went wrong, and for you to have a dialogue with the participant about where and how this experience has gone wrong, because they're not, halfway through a giant task. Another really important thing to think about is timing. Unfortunately, assistive technology users do take longer to do things. With the, where we are right now, it's a fact. And so you need to think about timing, especially if it's a website or an app that someone has never used before and they're completely unfamiliar with it. The first time they try and perform a task with the app is going to take them a lot longer, because they may have to do some exploration. They have to do some familiarization. They have to figure out what works and what doesn't. And so the best way to figure that out is simply to allow a little bit of extra time. The suggestion that I always make is based on a suggestion that is very popular in the education sector. When you are giving an assistive technology user an exam or a test in school or in university, you generally allow them time and a half. And so when you are conducting a task with a participant who uses assistive technology, it's a pretty good guideline to assume that it's going to take them, 1.5 times what it would take you. And that will make sure that you're leaving enough time to get through all of the tasks that you want to get through, and without, feeling stressed. And it's just a good estimate to have. And that time and a half is something that people with disabilities often expect and often account for as well. So sometimes it's tempting to say, oh, this is taking someone a long time, it must be a bad experience. Not necessarily. It depends on the assistive technology, it depends on the person. Again, time and a half is a good guide, a good metric to have in mind here. Of course, if it's taking them 8 times longer, I mean, that's a terrible experience. It's an inaccessible experience. It's an inefficient experience. Nobody's going to do that. But if it's sort of time and a half, no longer than that, that's pretty good. So once you've done the research, you've got all these great results, you've learned all this great stuff. Lastly, it's time to follow up. So following up, the first thing is prioritizing your results. And working with people with disabilities allows you to figure out that prioritization and to figure out putting together those results in ways that perhaps automated testing or some third-party audit will not, because you have a lot more context than you would if you were using an automated test or some third-party audit. Because you've worked with users of assistive technology, you can now say, okay, we found a bunch of flaws that are preventing people from using the website. They can't complete a task independently. They can't add something to their shopping cart. They can't log in, whatever it is. If there is an error or a flaw preventing someone from doing something, that's high priority. That should be fixed right away. Even if the other issues still exist, if somebody can complete something independently, that's a big win. As a person with a disability, there are tasks that I have to complete. The rent has to be paid. And if the website is a little bit inaccessible, well, that's frustrating and that's annoying, but it's critical that I can actually do it. And so that's the first metric to be focused on, is that task completion. Anything that's preventing a task from being independently completed by an assistive technology user, it's high priority. It's got to be fixed. It's super important. And then once you figure out the high priority stuff and you're at that 100% task completion, everyone can get things done independently. Now you want to start looking at the medium priority stuff, the barriers that required workarounds, the things that made the task inefficient, that made it take longer. A page that none of the buttons were labeled, but they were able to figure out what it was, or the page that pressing enter didn't work, but pressing space did, so it was confusing. They were able to work around it and figure it out. Then you want to fix all of that medium priority stuff. Once you've got an experience that's workable, now you want to work toward an experience that doesn't require workarounds, that doesn't require inefficiencies. And then last, but certainly not least, are the barriers that are annoying, the things that caused a little bit of confusion, the unnecessarily verbose alerts, the alt text on the marketing image that was a little bit inaccurate, the button that was not quite labeled properly. You want to fix those things. And once you fix those, now you have a website where people can complete all the tasks. They can do it in a way that is fast and that is efficient, and in a way that doesn't have any of these little errors that is causing any confusion. And that's how you get to a website that is completely accessible. When you focus on checklists, sometimes you don't get there because you've just got all these errors and you don't know how to prioritize any of them. And so sometimes you're spending your time fixing really low priority errors when there's a bug preventing people from even logging in. And working with assistive technology users doing that testing, the first piece of value you get out of it is that context that allows you to prioritize actually fixing problems that are real problems for users. Once you've prioritized your results, the other thing that you can do, and that is really important, is measuring improvement. This is why it's so important that accessibility testing is part of a process. Because if you do it as something that is project-based and that happens once every 5 years, once every 3 years, maybe once every year, you have no way to measure what you're doing. What you want to be doing is you want to have a regular pool of participants that you work with and that you test with so that you can make sure, okay, we did this research. We found that 80% of participants couldn't even complete all of our tasks. Let's get these fixed. Now let's retest. Great. Only 2% of our participants couldn't complete tasks. You can measure that improvement and you can see the improvement that you've made as you've prioritized those tasks. Another way that is really useful to measure the experience that assistive technology users are having is the AUS, or the AUS, Accessible Usability Scale. It's something that Fable has created that was adapted from the SUS, or the System Usability Scale. And it's really intended to do the same thing that the SUS does in a way that has been adapted to work better for assistive technology users. Some of you who are familiar with the SUS may remember one of the questions that it has on it, for example, is, I would need the help of a technical user in order to complete this task. And for example, for me as a screen reader user, I am a technical user. I've been programming and using screen readers all of my life. 99% of the time when I can't complete a task, I just need somebody who can see because there's something inaccessible. And so we adapted that to say, I would need the help of another user to complete this task, so that you can really get the feedback in an easy to understand way and in a way that is applicable to assistive technology users. And that's another great measurement. But one measurement that people are tempted to rely on, and that people who want to rely on, and that isn't useful, is time to completion, because it can vary pretty widely. If you are comparing the time that I, as a screen reader user, take to the time that Stephen Hawking takes, to the time that a screen magnification user takes, to the time that a user of a switch system or a head mouse takes, what are you learning, right? The expectations of how long a task should take to complete can vary from one disability to another, from one assistive technology to another, and it can vary from one user to another. Some of us who are more experienced run our screen readers at 500 words per minute. Some of us who are maybe a little bit older or a little bit less experienced, or have challenges that make it hard to hear or understand a voice at that speed, will run their screen reader at 75 words per minute. And so the time that they expect a task to take is going to wildly vary just on their personal circumstances, even if they're using the same assistive technology as someone else. So time to task completion is not a great measurement. It doesn't tell you a lot, because who are you comparing it to? Who are you getting it from? It's not even comparable, like, between individuals. And so focusing on experiential things like the OS, and focusing on metrics like task completion are way more valuable. And we at Fable, when we're doing research, we don't even think about time to completion too much, unless it's like way out there. You know what I mean? Unless it's taking 10 times longer than normal or 12 times longer than normal. And often when things take that long, people give up. People aren't going to spend an hour and a half trying to add something to the shopping cart. Eventually someone's going to say, hey, I can't do this. I'm done. And then you'll get that incomplete, which is a far more important metric for you to be measuring. The last thing to do as you're following up is compensate participants. I know I talked about this a little bit during the recruiting section, but I want to reiterate it here because it's so important. Most participants will have access to fully accessible online banking or a method to accept online payments. There is a bunch of myths around gift cards. First of all, that gift cards are somehow more accessible, and that's just not true. Often gift cards have printed numbers or have some code that you have to fill out, or you have to redeem them on a website that itself may not be accessible, And so when you give a gift card, you've taken away the participant's choice to be able to redeem it in a way that is accessible to them and to be able to use it in a way that is accessible. And plus, of course, gift cards just aren't a great way to compensate skilled research participants. If you were trying to, conduct research with a bunch of certified public accountants, you probably wouldn't compensate them in gift cards because you're looking for a very specific skill. And in the same way, use of assistive technology is a fairly specific skill, and it deserves to be compensated with actual money. There's also a little bit of a myth that, oh, if we compensate participants who are on government benefits with gift cards, that won't affect their benefits. And that's not really true. Gift cards count as income. They affect the benefits in the same way that a cash payment would. The problem is they're not flexible in the same way that a cash payment would be. If you are a participant who is reliant on government benefits, you can't pay the rent with a gift card. And so for those reasons, it's really important to compensate folks with actual money. If you don't want to get into collecting banking details and doing all of that stuff, there are a lot of online payment providers that have a focus on accessibility. In Canada here, Interac e-transfers work great without having to collect all of that bank deposit information. PayPal is also on the international market, a service that has great accessibility and that a lot of participants will be perfectly familiar with and perfectly comfortable using. And so once you've compensated participants, once you've followed up, once you've prioritized your results, hopefully this is getting you into a regular testing cycle and a regular testing process. And if you do all of these things, you're going to have results that are high quality. You're going to be able to act on those results. And you're also going to be able to conduct future research much, much easier because you've got participants who, if they weren't a good fit for your current research, have been followed up with and feel heard. And the participants who participated this time have been fairly compensated. They've hopefully had a smooth experience with accessible tools, signing accessible contracts in accessible environments. And when they have a smooth experience like that, the other thing that they're going to do is give you the power of word of mouth. And so if you have future engagements, you'll get your participants in your last research project saying, hey, I know people who would be great for you to work with. And when you get a word of mouth referral like that, that's an even higher trust relationship than working with some community partner. And that is how you can build and expand a pool of participants. And that is how you can get into the virtuous cycle of doing great research, getting great results from a great participant pool. I know I've covered a whole lot in this talk. It's been a real whirlwind, and you've all been listening to me talk away for about 40 minutes now. So I would love to open the floor to Q&A. I am available on LinkedIn. I'm certainly available via email. And I'm certainly happy to take any questions about accessibility research, about accessibility testing, about methodology, or about anything else that I have covered in this talk that you would like to ask. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope that you have found some great takeaways from this talk that are useful to you and that you will be able to act on going forward so that you can make research and testing involving people with disabilities something that is a part of your platform, something that is a part of your processes going forward, and something that isn't just something you do one time, but rather is something that you do regularly to make sure that you're building processes that include everyone. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks so much for that talk, Sam. We're just going to kick off our break now. We're going to come back together at the 20-minute mark, whatever hour that is for you where you are. And in the meantime, I'll just encourage people to put any questions that come up for them in the Q&A portion, and we'll Okay, we are back from break. Very exciting. So we've got 2 talks left, and first up is Kate. And today her title of her talk, sorry, is Are Co-Creation Methods Really Inclusive? How can your team, sorry, I'm butchering this, Kate. How your team can build equity into co-creation sessions. All right, so Kate is a white woman in her early 20s. She has medium length brown hair that
All right, let's get started. So today I'm going to be talking about inclusive co-creation and adapting, remixing, and disrupting co-creation techniques from an equity-centered perspective. So I wanted to start out with this quote: "Participatory processes can vary by the degree to which they merely display participation or seek meaningful action." So that's the crux of what we're going to be talking about today: the difference between doing co-creation to meet a requirement versus really deeply engaging with the people that you're looking to serve. So let's jump in and talk a little bit about why disrupt standard methods of co-creation and the basis for which this presentation and the project that I'll be talking about today is based in. So the starting point for my research and my work in this space was how might we improve the outcomes and experiences of co-creation sessions for both historically underinvested communities and the researchers and designers who work alongside them. So really looking at how this can be used as a community tool, as well as something that can create design outcomes for organizations. So what are some of the issues with existing methods of co-creation? Well, there's several different types of co-creation methods, but these issues tend to arise with all of them, depending on how they're used. So the first is rigid templating that is too focused on collecting data. So what this means is a lot of times co-creation sessions will be very, very structured. So you'll have a slideshow or a mural board or something like that with a series of prompts. And it will be very rigid in terms of you have to respond to this prompt and like write something down for each one. So it's not very flexible in terms of what you can talk about, what you can create, those types of things. So the second issue is kind of tied to the first one in that there's a lack of reflection and slow creation processes. So what this means is that a lot of times the sessions are very focused on collecting data quickly, working with a large group, and there isn't a lot of time for really discussing with the participant and really understanding why they created what they created, what it means to them, all of those types of questions that really make co-creation such an interesting method to use. And the third is that they aren't always adaptable for different mindsets and situations. So I already touched on this a little bit, but what I found through my research is that oftentimes co-creation is very focused on one way of working. So you might have a session where you want people to draw out wireframes or annotate a design or something like that. But if that doesn't work for that particular person, they might not feel as engaged with your session, and you're missing out on really valuable data if you opened up the ways that people can participate in the session. This is really important as well when working with people who are neurodivergent, but really anyone can benefit from a range of different ways to contribute to a co-creation session. So before I dived into research with users and actually into co-creation focused research, I conducted interviews with designers to understand how they felt about co-creation and its use. So one designer said that they felt like co-creation and co-design is a buzzword that feels very nebulous. So they didn't really know where co-creation began and other methods end, and what they could really use co-creation for besides it just being like an innovative method that they hadn't tried before. So that was really the core problem that I was looking to solve, is how can this be more meaningful both to participants and to designers and researchers? So we talked a little bit about issues and confusion around co-creation. So what should co-creation never be? So it really shouldn't be a one-off workshop, an item on a checklist, only used a part of the process, or really, as the quote at the beginning stated, you shouldn't be just extracting outputs from users that don't influence outcomes. So you really want to make sure if you're going to host a co-creation session to the best of your team's abilities that you're going to leverage that feedback into meaningful change in either a product or service or some type of community change or whatever it is that you're working on. Okay, so a little bit about the research I conducted about co-creation, both primary and secondary. So I conducted research to create a toolkit for equity-centered co-creation with the goal of enabling underinvested communities to leverage co-creation for positive change. So the project started out by me originally researching how to engage communities of underrepresented artists. So that was the specific population I was focused on. And originally I thought I would create an app or some sort of other intervention, but I realized that community collaboration tools and ways to influence decision-making in these types of communities was really the main thing that I was interested in researching further. So on screen, there's a Venn diagram of all of the different areas that I researched. So on the left, I was looking at lived experiences of artists, so financial perceptions, established business skills, freelancing experience, and so on. And on the right were educational and community aspects. So looking at community and collaboration, informal learning communities, universal design for learning. And so at the intersection of all of that is co-creation for equity in communities, which is what I chose to focus my undergraduate thesis on. So the research itself was conducted with 25 plus early career artists, and it was focused on co-creation for artistic community creation. So it was really involving trialing different co-creation methods after a round of in-depth interviews to really deeply understand this group of participants. So in terms of research methods that I used, I conducted one-on-one interviews with people from a range of different backgrounds, focused on learning, education, community building, really to just get a sense of would co-creation work for these types of communities? How can it be used? What are people's needs? That type of thing. Then I did literature research. So what are current co-creation methods? Is there anything already looking at marginalized groups? There was a few, but it really wasn't as in-depth as I was hoping. And then actually conducting trial co-creation sessions with participants. So trying out different methods, frameworks, just to see what could work better for people. And then also looking at existing types of toolkits and frameworks to see the best ways that these ideas could be communicated. So with tons of synthesis later, I came out with a bunch of different learnings about co-creation and co-design. So the main thing that I found out through, especially my research with designers and my review of secondary research, is that co-creation and co-design sessions are often just viewed for gathering data. And there's nothing wrong with that inherently. We want to collect data when we're researching. It can often become a little bit exploitative when people are putting all of this time into creating ideas that then aren't used and they don't have control over those ideas anymore either. So really the issue here is that a lot of times even organizations and designers didn't know how to use co-creation for anything else or didn't even realize that this was an issue. So with my toolkit, the goal is to demonstrate these methodologies' impact in shared learning and community building for these diverse communities. So let's chat a little bit about learning through doing. So how I developed these co-creation improvements. So on screen are some samples of outputs from users. So one of them is showing different drawings and thoughts in response to a prompt about COVID and being an artist. And on the right is someone who wrote out a bunch of different ideas. So just showing some of the different ways that users might respond to the exact same prompt. So this was really something that struck me as interesting, is that even when the constraints are very narrow, everybody will think about the prompts very differently, which might seem obvious, but you wouldn't expect necessarily this huge range of responses that you get back for people, and even the ways that different people use the tools. And then secondary to this, I was really looking at the area of building psychological safety. So taking careful preparation and having a deep knowledge of the community you're working with is really important for this, because you want people to feel safe in the sessions. And if you're able to kind of resonate with them and what they are feeling and thinking, it's a lot easier to do that. So kind of taking yourself out of the researcher shoes and into the collaborator shoes is really important here. So on the right is an example of where someone opened up, kind of stating that when they are participating in a community, they're really excited to see people like them. So this particular person had expressed that in current communities and community engagements, they really didn't see a lot of people like them. So allowing for a flexible and creative environment breeds new insights and more value for your participants. So if you open up the floor for participants to explore and create what they want, you're more likely to get authentic outputs and really something that's both meaningful to your team and to your participants. So here, there's one example of where a user both wrote and drew different things to express their idea. And as well as this, they were narrating to me what they were drawing and doing as they worked. So having all of these different ways of inputting information is really important. Some users might only write, some might only draw, but you'll get the inputs that feel most comfortable to them, which generally does result in better ideas and insights. So kind of again, don't restrict the outputs and responses from your users. So again, just more different ways of participating. So what are some different barriers that might arise when bringing participants into co-creation sessions? So I did find that depending on the population that I was working with, a lot of people did feel very uncomfortable or even alienated when participating in co-creation. So a lot of times it can be very intimidating for people. And it's really important to think about as a researcher or a designer, how your session might be scary to someone. So it can be really scary to put yourself out there, to express ideas to someone you don't know, all of those different things, especially if you come from a different background or kind of space than your participant does. So yeah, I found a lot of participants did find these community intervention methods using co-creation to be a bit intimidating at first. Additionally, something that can also kind of heighten that anxiety around co-creation is that participants can often be hesitant to provide input on existing concepts or prototypes. So a lot of times co-creation will involve looking at something that the company has already come up with or giving feedback on concepts and creating your own concepts from that. But I found that users often prefer to start with a blank slate rather than give input on ideas. And you also tend to not get as genuine of feedback with these types of methods, since people understandably are a bit nervous to give negative feedback on something that they think you have worked hard on. It's not to say you can't do it, but just be aware that existing concepts and prototypes do tend to be more limiting compared to letting users kind of create their own concepts. So then another additional thing I found was that having a dialogue about each question and its purpose often helps the participant feel more at ease. So I think all of us can kind of relate to the idea that when we have more information about why we're giving out information or why a certain question is being asked, we're probably more likely to answer it and to feel comfortable giving a genuine answer. So you really want to put people at ease here. So if you're asking something really personal about someone's lived experience of racism or something like that, and you're asking them what would make that better for them in a situation, what could remedy that, you want to be really sensitive to that someone might not feel comfortable answering those kinds of questions if they don't know why you're asking them and what is going to come out of them. So just being really transparent about all of that, especially during the consent process. And then jumping into some of the challenges of remote. So one thing that I found conducting this research during COVID is that, and I'm sure lots of you have observed this too in your own research and design processes, is it can be very challenging to engage with people through a remote environment. So interviews are pretty straightforward. You know, you can do them over the phone or on Zoom. But doing research where it involves co-creation, it involves tools that users might not be familiar with, is a lot more complex in a remote format. So on screen, there is this image of one user's inputs where they only really felt comfortable filling out one sticky note, and this was actually assisted as well. So it was a challenge with some users to help them navigate tools like Miro and be able to contribute in the way that they wanted to. So it wasn't that they didn't want to participate, it was just genuinely challenging to use the tools. So roadblocks were really apparent when working within the online medium for interacting with my participant group. So a lot of times tools would only work on desktop and the participant only had a phone, or their internet connection was spotty and we had to work around that. So just being prepared for all of those different challenges that might arise. You don't want to inadvertently exclude someone from your research by only working in Mural, for instance, or only working in Mural, since those tools do require a higher level of technical capability, internet connection, comfort level, so on and so forth. So some great alternatives for that are working in tools like Google Slides to put sticky notes on and draw things, Google Jamboard, lots of different tools. And then you can also work on paper. So one tactic that I realized was a good thing to do in these situations was have participants draw it out on a piece of paper and then photograph it and upload it. Or alternatively, they can dictate responses to you or things like that. So just finding all of these different creative ways to work around the challenges of remote is really important if you're conducting a remote session. Okay, so jumping into the toolkit itself and some final takeaways. So what was the outcome of all this research? A toolkit. So looking inside the toolkit, there is a series of modules to help people get started with inclusive co-creation. So it involves a description of each module. On screen here, the introduction to module 1 is it has a paragraph intro, definition of terms, a guide to getting started. So there's 3 total modules like that. And then there is also a case study, including the before and after of the application of inclusive methods, which is shown on screen here. So there's modules with tactics to try out, from warm-ups to methods of dialogue, as well as the case study of my own research, showing quotes from users, as well as quotes from secondary research that I conducted. So this toolkit is designed to be a quick start guide to help you design your sessions. It also has templates that you can feel free to remix and reuse for your own purposes. So all of those different things should help you get started with your journey with inclusive co-creation. So reflecting a little bit on the project, this was a big pivot for me from my typical product design and more traditional user research work, but I'm really excited to have done it and to keep working on it. I'm still learning all the time. This is still a very emerging space and there's lots to learn and try out. And I encourage you to experiment as well and to try out new things and just set up new methods and really experiment and find out what works best for the particular population that you're working with. So if you want to download the toolkit and explore it further, you can go to Colens, COLENS.design for the downloadable toolkit, worksheets, and more information. The full toolkit is available completely for free to download, as well as other resources on the website. So definitely feel free to check that out and use it in your projects. All right, so thank you so much for listening. I hope you took something away from this that can help you in your own work. I'd love to hear any comments or questions and anyone else who's tried out inclusive co-creation techniques. So you can connect with me on Twitter at Kate_Matesic, MATESIC, and then katematesic.com, or by email at hello@katematesic.com.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Kate. And this brings us to our final talk today, and that's by Tyler. So Tyler's talk is 11 minutes, entitled Letters, Optics, and the Visual Cortex. So Tyler's a 30-year-old Caucasian male with short hair and a beard. He's sitting in a white room with assorted climbing gear.
Hi, I'm Tyler Hawkins, and my talk is called Letters, Optics, and the Visual Cortex. I'll be talking about fonts and low vision. I'll give verbal descriptions of my slides for accessibility, sometimes as I switch to a new slide, sometimes after I give a bit more context. The first slide includes a talk title on the left, and on the right is a rendering of the tissues and muscles of the iris. So with that, I'll go into a quick introduction. Reading is not a trivial task. We depend on it for social connection, access to information, and employment. 250 million rods and cones in your eyes detect light bouncing off of letters and then relay electrical signals to the language centers in your brain for identification and interpretation. Written language is an incredibly useful invention, but it's not perfect. We take it for granted. Type design specifically for low vision is a pretty recent phenomenon and has implications for how we think about accessibility in design. With this talk, I'll do my best to summarize the current scientific understanding of how we read and how that informs font design for low vision. I'll start with some background and align with a bit on the project that I'm currently working on. So who am I? My name is Tyler. I'm a designer living on the unceded territory of the Squamish Nation here in Squamish, BC. I've worked on a variety of projects with the Health Design Lab at Emily Carr. More recently, I started the Access Font project. We're working with the Disability Alliance of BC, the Canadian Accessible Technology Program, and a few developers to make a tool that tailors font files to very low vision. Much of this talk will come from the research and conversations I've had informing that project. My interest in all of this really came from working in visual design and wanting to understand its limitations. My pronouns are he and him. I do want to reiterate that my background is in design. I'm not a vision scientist. I think of this talk as a sort of practical literature review. I owe much of my understanding to conversations with people in the low vision community, as well as researchers like Sophie Byer, Kevin Larson, Aries Arditi, and Elizabeth Russell-Minda. My role is listening, synthesizing, and trying to be a better designer. Also, I'm going to try and keep this fairly high level and not get too deep into the weeds. I'm a bit of a nerd for this stuff, but it gets pretty nerdy. Anyone who wants to chat more, I'm always happy to. So with that, I'll start with a bit of background. What am I talking about? Sometimes it's referred to as visual impairment. I prefer low vision. The term most often describes a broad range of vision from 20/40 acuity to legal blindness from a variety of sources, including refractive errors, cataracts, glaucoma, diabetic retinopathy, and others. Some estimates suggest that people with more advanced low vision are employed at roughly half the rate of the general population and at half the rate of post-secondary education. Very generally speaking, low vision results in a variety of blurs and inconsistencies in the visual field. These graphics are reproductions of similar ones by Thomas Baum, representing various sources of low vision, macular degeneration, glaucoma, and diabetic retinopathy. From conversations, I've found that many people with low vision read better on screen than on paper. It's important to note that the experience of low vision is incredibly diverse. What works for one person will not work for others. That said, there are some general takeaways. So fonts, type design. When we design or choose fonts, there's a lot to consider. Type itself is a centuries-old craft full of nuance and optical effects. This graphic shows the control points designers tweak to draw the Bezier curves making up the letters, here a lowercase g, representing just a small sample of the many decisions that go into making a font. One commonly held belief is that serif fonts, such as OGG on the left, are more legible than sans serifs, such as work sans on the right. There's just not a lot of evidence to support this. Most studies show little benefit to serifs. Some argue that the added complexity interferes with the essential skeletons of the letters. Others argue that the inconsistencies in line widths, also called weight, obscure fine details with low vision. Many fonts for low vision are therefore sans serifs. Another commonly mistaken belief is that we read by word shapes more so than by letter shapes. Herman Boehme found that letters are more accurately recognized in the context of words, and that we read text set in lowercase better than text set entirely in capitals, suggesting word shapes play an important role in reading. However, this has since been largely refuted. Letters set in groups of non-words are recognized just as well, and the ease of reading lowercase has since been attributed to the effect of familiarity in practice. We hardly ever read text set in all capitals. This graphic by Kevin Larson shows an outline around the word shape set in lowercase, depicting its Boehme shape. Sophie Byer, head of the Center of Visibility Design at the Royal Danish Academy, further breaks down legibility into the roles of familiarity and visibility. She describes visibility as the near instant perception of letter shapes, and familiarity as the influence of matching incoming perceptions with mental expectations of letter shapes to identify, name, and associate meaning to text. In her PhD, she discusses the studies supporting this. The way we design and choose fonts can be seen as directly related to these two factors. So let's talk about visibility and perception. The roughly 240 million rod photoreceptors in your eyes are sensitive to motion. Your 10 million cones are more sensitive to fine details. The center of your retina, the fovea, contains the majority of your cones, and you see clearest in the center of your vision. This graphic is a reproduction of a graphic by Sophie Byer, depicting 3 lowercase days, The one in the center, representing the fovea, is clearest. The next, less clear. And finally, the last, representing peripheral vision, is the blurriest. When you read, your eyes do not progress smoothly through text one letter at a time. Your fovea focuses on a few letters, identifying those just to the right simultaneously, and then jumps forward through unconscious movements called saccades. We center our vision on a few letters, identify them in parallel, and then jump ahead. This graphic from Kevin Larson represents just this, using a line to represent the path your vision might follow. Another effect to be aware of is something called crowding. Crowding describes how letter shapes influence each other, blurring them out and crowding the clarity of surrounding letter shapes. Type designers working on fonts for low vision often compensate for these effects by clarifying and improving the visual signals sent to the brain. Opening letter shapes has been found to reduce the impact of letters blurring in on themselves. Spacing letters apart minimizes crowding, so they don't blur each other out. This graphic shows both, highlighting the open shape in the lowercase e and the space between an A and a lowercase c. Letter weights also impact visibility. Light weights can blur out with low vision, and so can the negative space in black or ultra bold weights. I suggested avoiding them. So, familiarity. The eyes deliver electrical signals to the brain for identification and interpretation. We read through matching incoming visual signals to mental expectations of letter shapes. Expectations are informed by experience, practice, and familiarity. And so we read familiar fonts faster and with better comprehension than unfamiliar fonts. The problem is that many of the letters we're familiar with were not optimized for low vision. So familiarity, and on the other hand, enhancing letters for improved identification. Fortunately, there's been some work showing that familiarity can be learned and letters can be improved. Often this means increasing differentiation between letters. For hundreds of years, designers have relied on regularity to bring harmony into fonts, but too much regularity can lead to letter misidentification. In the same way that you often mistake zeros and capital O's or lowercase l's and capital I's, people with low vision do too. The subtleties which might help people with high acuity recognize letter distinctions can be lost with low vision. So, type designers exaggerate the differentiation between commonly misidentified letters. The tails on lowercase l's help minimize confusion between capital I's and ones. A serif on the top of the stem of the lowercase I helps prevent similar confusion. Dashes or dots and zeros help minimize confusion with capital O's, as shown here. Other choices, like choosing two-story lowercase a's and g's, help differentiate from letters that share the more common single-story O shape, as is depicted here. Paragraph text appears to be more sensitive to unfamiliar shapes. They can distract and slow reading. Because letter identification is informed by familiarity, all of this is a balance between conventional letter shapes and unconventional enhancements. So what? How do we work with this as designers? So the first thing I'd recommend is to choose fonts that include many of the features I've mentioned. Places to look, I recommend include Atkinson Hyperlegible, Fontsmith's FSME, Lexend, and also WorkSans. Those last two weren't designed specifically for low vision, but they include features that work in many of the same directions. This presentation and Magnify itself actually both use WorkSans. It's great. This image is a blog post I really like that reads Atkinson Hyperlegible font may be pretty good if your granny can't see well. Find it, check it out. It's a great story from a guy just helping his grandmother. The second thing I recommend is involving people with low vision in the design process whenever possible. Also do your homework. Look out for more research on this stuff. It's fairly new and it's evolving, but there's really interesting work being done. Lastly, I do have to mention the project I'm working on. We're taking many of these techniques and making them adjustable. They're great fonts for low vision. They're great font customization tools. We seem to be among the first to be releasing a free tool to do both. This image shows a draft web page depicting our browser extension. So that's my talk. Thank you to Magnify for organizing. Thanks for everyone in attendance and everyone who's contributed to the Access Point project. Don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. Be more than happy to chat.
Okay, great. So we are done our 4 talks. Very cool. We're going to take a break now just for 15 minutes and regroup at the 5 minute after the hour where you are. and then come back and the speakers will get to answering your questions live. So definitely feel free to submit anything still outstanding in your head around questions to the Okay, so we are now at the Q&A portion of today. So how this is going to work is we're just going to go speaker by speaker, ask them to speak to any questions they want to answer from the chat, and then we've also got a couple prepared depending on how time goes. I think we might just stick with the order of the talks today. So, Anita, you're up first. Are you ready?
Yes, I think that most of the questions actually got answered in the chat. It sounds like there's quite a few people here who have worked on these kind of privacy and consent forms and putting them into plain language with content design. And there was a question about getting the government of Canada to approve these, which I'm happy to talk about in more detail with the person who posted the question. But I will say that at CDS, we are very fortunate that we have a policy team that is very committed to making things accessible and really collaborates with us in trying to do that. So they don't put up a lot of barriers to us. They'll point out things that need to change, and they'll work with us to get it to a point that satisfies both content design principles and what they need. And similarly, they work with lawyers at the Treasury Board Secretariat who are also who have a similar point of view and often make suggestions that are actually really helpful. So we've been lucky to have subject matter experts for this particular item that are really collaborative and actually almost champion the process, but I know that's not the case everywhere.
Yeah, that's such a great setup you have. Definitely envious. That's very cool. um, okay, Sam, I think you've got a couple of questions your way. Was there one you wanted to answer?
Absolutely. I saved a couple of questions to answer as I knew that the Q&A period was coming up. So, first of all, there's a really interesting question about cash and kind of the inability to necessarily pay with cash. I work within a university/health authority setting, and we've not been allowed to provide cash as a mode of compensation for research participants because it can't be tracked easily, and research participant is remote. We agree that gift cards are not a great standard. We wonder what advice you have. And so, what I would say is that if you absolutely can't do cash for whatever reason, there are what I'm going to call kind of quasi gift cards, which is things that are like gift cards that have way more flexibility than a gift card might. So, for example, Visa puts out kind of like preloaded credit cards with a certain amount on them that are accepted basically anywhere a Visa card is accepted, which provides a lot more flexibility, and it's a lot more similar to cash. MasterCard does the same thing. I think services like PayPal also have, like, you can buy kind of preloaded balance cards. But the basic idea is that these kind of things, while they're a preloaded card in the way that a gift card might be, so that offers you all of the trackability and invoiceability and things of gift cards, they're generally accepted anywhere that cash may be. So the participant, isn't losing out on that flexibility. And if what they really need is the money from the participation in your research to help pay the rent that month, they could make that happen. And the second question, we've been talking a little bit in the Q&A and in the chat, kind of about technical products and about how to do research involving people with disabilities when your product may not have any users who have disabilities. Because what can happen is you can get caught in this vicious circle of, well, I'd like to do research involving people with disabilities who use my product so I can make my product accessible, but my product isn't accessible, so I don't have any users with disabilities, so I can't do research with users with disabilities who use my product, and you get into this circle. And so what I really advise is trying to expand out of that circle, trying to figure out how you can bring on users with disabilities who may not be familiar with your product, who may not be experts in your space, in order to do that research. Because often, in order to identify that something isn't working with my assistive technology, I don't need to be an expert in the thing. I don't need to be an accountant to realize that my screen reader can't activate any of the buttons, or I can't type into any of the edit fields, or the heading structure is so terrible that I can't tell what anything's for. So that's one thing. Some other things that you could do, if you have kind of a training type of website where you're actually training new folks to onboard onto your product, you could start by doing accessibility testing of your training, and then you could use those participants who, of course, have already been through your training because they've tested it for accessibility and helped you get to a point where all of your training and onboarding material is accessible, to then also help you get to a point where your product is accessible. So there's a couple of techniques there. Again, depending on what area you're in, if you are, say, a coding website, you could do research. with users who use another coding website or another accounting website because they're already familiar with the terms of art and with all of that stuff. They just might not be familiar with your product. So really what it comes down to is anything you can do to expand that circle of people who can participate in your research so you don't get caught in the vicious circle. And I've gone on for way too long. So why don't I pass it back to you, Laura?
That was a really thorough answer. Thanks, Sam. Okay, Kate. I saw you answered, I think, the question that Jane posed to you. Was there anything else you wanted to speak to? Because if not, I also have a question to throw out there.
Yeah, there is a little bit more I wanted to say to speak to Jane's question. So I guess I'll just read that out loud. So Jane asked, I'm often working with clients or peers who see co-creation as one discrete step in the design process, usually in the form of a workshop. What are some ways you suggest we encourage co-creation to be an interactive and multi-step form of engagement? So I think this is a really great question, just because co-creation is kind of one of the newer design methods around. Not everybody's super familiar with the value that you can get from it. So I would say what I found with a lot of my projects is you can bring it in on a smaller scale throughout. So don't feel pressured that you have to run a bunch of big workshops throughout a project to do co-creation. It can even just be talking to someone with lived experience and like connecting with them at each stage of the process. It doesn't have to be a super formal workshop. So even if you can get buy-in to bring in a diverse range of people to chat with them and get input on your designs, even that can be a great way to get some of the insights that co-creation can give you.
Very cool. Great. Tyler, you're up. Did you see a question there that you wanted to answer?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had a kind of quick question about some of the things that I mentioned in the talk, adding some resources. So that blog post I just put in the Slack, there's a question about the fonts I sort of recommended and places to look. And I'll kind of touch on that quick. There's a few fonts that work really well available from Google Fonts. So Atkinson Hyperlegible is pretty fantastic. WorkSense is involved in the design of this conference and something that I used in my talk as well. It's free, it's built really well. It doesn't work specifically for low vision, but it hits a lot of the same legibility goals. And so it's definitely a place to look. Sophie Byers, the head of the Center of Visibility Design at the Royal Danish Academy, she does a lot of really good research that sort of spans between the scientific communities and the type design communities. So if you're interested in this stuff, just sort of generally, there's a page on her website, and I'll throw that in the resources as well, that does a kind of quick summary of some of the work that she's been working on. And just a ton of respect to her, as well as a few of the other people I spoke to, or I kind of read up on and for the project. So yeah, there's a lot of really interesting work. I did have one specific question as to where we're at with the Access Font project and kind of what phase of that project we're in. So basically, I built the first prototype of this thing and kind of did kind of preliminary research and all that sort of stuff. And then we started assembling a team and got a little bit of support. And so this spring, we started into the next sort of major phase. So I've gone through a handful of conversations with people with low vision and in that community, this sort of start engagement and figure out kind of more assistive kind of devices and technologies being kind of used in parallel, and some of the sort of like wants and needs, and also some of the wants and needs on the web design side of things as well. I've come from more of the font background, and so I've been learning a ton about web accessibility. And so yeah, we're approaching getting kind of a first draft of the web tool finished. That should be done by right around the end of this month, and then we'll go into our sort of like first big participatory sort of like research phase before the end of the year. So I've been so excited to hear from all of these talks. This could not be more perfect. I've been taking so many notes. Sam, you had so many good practical tidbits in there. So I'm hugely appreciative to everyone involved. And yeah, so from there, we'll kind of revise and get a publicly available free sort of first publicly available version March 31st. So yeah, keep you guys posted. We don't really have things to share or social accounts or things like that yet. And, we might not actually have social accounts for this project ever. If you need that, please let me know. But anyway, we'll keep things posted. So yeah, thanks to everyone involved, and thanks for your questions and that sort of thing. Oh, obviously, yeah, I don't think I've put links to where to reach out to me, but if you Google Tyler Hawkins or find my LinkedIn or something, please don't hesitate. Or actually, the Slack through Magnify is fantastic. So yeah.
Well, that's great. You caught my question already about how we could follow along. So we'll find you on the internet and go from there. Awesome. Okay. I think we've answered all the questions from the Q&A. I'm just going to post some bigger questions to the group, and any of the speakers you guys can speak to, feel free. So taking in, like, especially Stan's and Kate's talk, I think you both really covered some good tips to remember. Things are like following up. And I think we can really make ourselves really busy in our work and forget about these more human parts of the process. So does anybody have any thoughts around how we can really grapple with that as professionals that they have to share as we do? If not, that's cool too. We don't have to go there.
It's a big, important question that requires thought. And I think the thing that occurs to me is something that I mentioned a lot in my talk. It's about developing an accessibility process and an accessibility journey, just like we have processes around equality and around inclusion and things like that. And if you build these human things like following up into the regular, recurring, documented process, then they will happen. Because good intentions are not enough. We can have the best intentions in the world and things don't happen. We've seen that. I think we see it every day, especially in accessibility. Nobody wants to build websites that I can't use. Nobody wants to create inaccessible things that don't work for people. Everybody wants to do the right thing. But the reason the right thing doesn't happen is because we aren't putting in place the processes to make it happen. And so I think it just in the same way that to make accessibility happen, you have to build it into your design and research processes. To make those human things happen, you've got to get those elements built in the process. You can't just say, oh, it's our policy that we do this, or we'd like to do this, or it would be nice to do this. You've got to actually define when it gets done and how you do it and who does it. And that is really what makes things happen.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a great point. Does anybody else want to add anything to that, or we can jump to the next question? Oh, is there another question in the Q&A? Oh my gosh, exciting. So somebody asked, hi, curious to know about the inclusion of fonts in different languages. I don't know, maybe Tyler, if you know anything about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think at one point in the draft of my talk, I sort of touched on kind of font accessibility and type accessibility, and how really I look at a very specific part of this, and that there are many other talks and there are many other kind of conversations we had behind that. Inclusivity obviously includes sort of language inclusivity as well. There are a number of people sort of working on this, and I'm not an expert, unfortunately. Noto Sans is something free from Google as well that includes a ton of support for a ton of different languages. Google Fonts does a lot of good sort of free accessible work on this front, I would suggest. But yeah, great question. I wish I had a stronger answer for you. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. Thanks, Tyler. Okay. I have another kind of big existential question, if that's how we want to end our conversation today. So no pressure, but just thinking about designing, bringing into sectors and spaces that we don't necessarily have a long history in doing so, and then let alone be doing so in an accessible way. I'm wondering if anybody has any thoughts around how you approach your work in terms of working towards that huge, big change, but in an incremental way, And if I always find that a big tension, to be honest. And I just wonder if other people have an experience they'd like to chat about. That's cool. I think we covered it well there. um, okay. Oh, there's another question here for Yadida. What different formats do you present your consent forms? For example, do you present it electronically to make it quicker?
So this was a form we worked on during the pandemic, and we've mostly been doing everything electronically during the pandemic. As Samuel was talking about, it's actually been a way to reach a lot of people. I don't know if we were doing a lot of in-person testing before the pandemic. I'm not sure what the plan is to move back to that, but that is a question more that Adrienne can answer, and I will take it back to CDS. And Claudia, can I send the response to you?
Yes, of course. Yep, that will look great.
And so Claudia will be able to send the response out.
Okay, great. My headphones just died, so hopefully you can still hear me okay. Everyone's smiling. I'm gonna take that as a good yes.
Yeah, your sound's a bit off now, but I think we're good to wrap up. Thank you to everyone who joined. And I'm unprepared to host, so today we have one more workshop, and then next week we're back with more talks. We start the week with Looking Within, and that is talks that are looking at the inclusion within our workspaces. So you'll hear from Simone, Hanier, and Holly. And yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask on Slack as well. Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.